Hello everybody, my name is Ray, and today I'll be giving you a presentation about something that is very recent news, which is Ukraine. As you've probably heard, there's a Russian buildup in Ukraine right now, and I'm here to tell you why it's happening. So first of all, let's start with background. Well, Ukraine was a Soviet Socialist Republic as part of the Soviet Union, where it was after being taken over by the Russian Tsardom. Eventually, the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic collaborated with Nazi Germany in World War II in order to achieve independence. However, they didn't achieve independence until 1991, at which point they had a very tumultuous but very profitable economic partnership with Russia, which, however, eventually ended in 2014. So why did this partnership end? Well, first off, we go through Euromaidan, which is the term for the very popular protests that happened in Ukraine from 2013 to 2014. During 2013, the Ukrainian public held a referendum whether they would want stronger ties with Russia or more closer ties with the EU, with the end result being more closer ties with the EU. However, President Viktor Yanukovych rejected this referendum and instead announced even more closer ties with Russia in direct violation to what the public wants. Eventually, protests started appearing in November 2013, with President Yanukovych ordering Ukrainian state security to open fire on protesters and arrest demonstrators. Eventually, this proved even too much for the rest of the Ukrainian government, with President Yanukovych, seen here with Vladimir Putin, being impeached by the Ukrainian parliament in February 2014. However, not everyone in Ukraine wanted to be in league with the EU. It's important to note that Ukraine is divided between two sides, Western and Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine is comprised primarily of ethnic Ukrainians, whereas Eastern Ukraine is comprised primarily of ethnic Russians. These ethnic Russians have very close ties to Russia, which eventually resulted in pro-Russian protests in Eastern Ukraine. These pro-Russian protests resulted in Russian intervention in the peninsula of Crimea. Why, though, is because the Russian Federation hosts a naval base in the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Eventually, the states of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine broke away, which eventually resulted in a long-standing civil war between these two breakaway states and the Ukrainian military, leading to several ceasefire agreements, known collectively as the Minsk agreements. Pictured here is Russian peacekeepers in Crimea, separatists in eastern Ukraine, as well as politicians during the first Minsk agreement. So, why now? Why is everything that's happening in Ukraine happening now? We need to go back to this man right here, Volodymyr Zelensky. Volodymyr Zelensky is a Ukrainian actor and comedian that was very popular in Ukrainian mainstream pop culture. Eventually, Volodymyr Zelensky ran for president in 2018 and beating out incumbent president Petro Poroshenko in 2019. Zelensky ran on an anti-corruption and anti-establishment platform with the goal of wiping out Ukrainian oligarchs as well as corruption everywhere in Ukraine and making sure Ukraine aligns further with the West instead of being under careful watch under Russia's shadow. Eventually, Zelensky started to pivot against Russia towards the West. That started with the arrest of pro-Russian lawmaker Viktor Medvedchuk, pictured seen here with Vladimir Putin. Eventually, Zelensky administration started banning pro-Russian news channels, as well as declaring public intentions to join the EU and NATO in the near future. Obviously, the Russian Federation did not take this lightly. It is important to note that the Russian Federation actually sees NATO as a continuation of Nazi Germany. This might sound preposterous to you, but this is actually something that goes into several high-profile Russian defense doctrinal papers. The aim being they do not want another onslaught like they encountered under Nazi Germany in 1942. Russia also fears that if Ukraine joins NATO, United States Air Force units, as well as forces from Britain, Germany, France, and other NATO countries will be placed in eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine actually has a lot of military bases and air bases. It's important to know that Kiev is actually within 100 kilometers away from Moscow. Russian doctrine also requires a need for buffer states. This is the reason why Russia wants to incorporate Belarus into a union again, as well as the reason why they occupy and still occupy parts of Georgia from the 2008 Georgia War. It's also important to note that Putin has imperialist tendencies in the sense that his most recent memoirs indicates that he considers that the breakup of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical crisis of the 20th century. His aims is to simply put, reform the Soviet Union. So what is the Russian objective? Well, obviously, and foremost, is preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. How to do this? Of course, is having a regime in Kiev, as Ukrainians are wholeheartedly rejecting Russian control over their country and sovereignty. It's also important to note that the larger goal is reforming Ukraine and Belarus, and eventually Kazakhstan, into a single union dominated by Russia, not unlike the Soviet Union. We can see this right now with the undermining of Belarusian security services in Belarus proper, as well as attempting to kidnap and murder Ukrainian politicians in Ukraine. So what happens now? Well, as of yesterday, there's 190,000 combat troops posted in the borders of eastern Ukraine as well as Belarus. There's also a massive propaganda campaign, for example, the shelling of a kindergarten, the genocide of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, as well as the shelling of a Russian town, which coincidentally is far away from the Ukrainian border. As of 2 days ago, the Duma, the Russian parliament, announced that they have formally recognized the breakaway Donbas regions as sovereign state entities and has therefore authorized the deployment of peacekeeping missions in the Donbas. The goal of these peacekeeping missions, however, is to simply put, create a false flag attempt that would give the pretext for Russia to invade the rest of Ukraine. The Western response being heavy Western sanctions, NATO rearmament, the deliveries of advanced anti-tech weapons, picture seen here, a British NLAW and a US Javelin, as well as the threatening of removing Russia from the SWIFT system, an international banking system which goes hand in hand with modern day trading. There's also would be the death row of Russia's economy. So why does it matter? Simply put, this chart. The entirety of Western Europe heavily relies on Russian gas exports. As you can see here, the Netherlands and Germany relies heavily on gas exports. Your heating, your cars, as well as power generation in our area is almost entirely relied on gas imports from Russia. Simply put, increase in gas prices, as well as the increase of defense spending, would lower the quality of life overall for us living here in Western Europe. I've also put several other pictures here. On the top left, you can see President Emmanuel Macron of France with President Vladimir Putin talking in disengagement. The Finnish foreign minister, as well as NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, after talking about potential Finnish membership to NATO in results of the Ukrainian crisis. The arrival of combat troops in the U.S. 101st Airborne Division in Poland as part of 3,000 strong U.S. deployment, as well as the training of foreign volunteers in Kiev that are training for a potential Russian offensive into Ukraine. So what is in store in the future? We don't know. A lot of things can happen, and a lot of analysts and a lot of statesmen think that he can either stop the Dnieper in the edge of Kiev or the complete control of Ukraine all the way to Lviv in western Ukraine. However, it's important to note that the general Ukrainian does not like Russia and does not want Russia in Ukraine or their country being controlled by Russia. So if we can see what happened with the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're in for a very bloody war that will last a very long time. Thank you. Any questions?